Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this live discussion. Now that it's January's behind us, everyone is done with their last minute and late minute annual planning session. So we figured, now's a good time to take a clear look at what trends we need to watch in 2025 regarding open source software risk management. So we're going to talk about 5 topics that we think are important to keep an eye on. That should take us about 35 minutes. Then we'd love to hear your questions or what you thought should have made the list as well. So anytime throughout the session, find that question panel, submit your questions, and I'll keep an eye on that. So let me go ahead and introduce you to our speakers today. We have Russ Eling, founder of OSS Consultants. OSS Consultants works with companies to understand the risk of using open, helps them define a management strategy to address them. So think of OSPO creation, OSPO as a service as well, open chain conformance, and SBOM management. A great case to look at, the Linux Foundation recently published a great case study highlighting their work with BlackBerry to implement an enterprise-wide OSPO and also apply the open chain ISO framework. Also, we have Jon Aldama, co-founder and chief product officer at FossID. FossID's software composition analysis tooling helps enterprises like Siemens, Bosch, Toyota, Sony, and many others inventory their third-party software usage and identify license risk and security vulnerabilities that may be lying within that third-party code. And FossID also provides open source audits, technical due diligence services, and various software security assessments as well. So that's it for introductions. Let's go ahead and get into it. Russ, I'm going to pass the ball to you and let you start off with prediction number 1.
All right, thanks so much, Aaron. So let's get started with one that shouldn't come as a big surprise given the growth in AI-generated code. So we think AI coding assistants specifically will play a more prominent role in software development in 2025. So this continuing shift, we think, will impact use and management of open source in practical ways. According to a GitHub report, there's been a surge in global generative AI activity. So we all know that AI is growing and evolving fast. According to that same GitHub report, in 2024, there was a 59% surge in the number of contributions to generative AI projects on GitHub and a 98% increase in the number of projects overall. So from my perspective in the consulting space, many of our clients were fairly concerned about the use of AI-generated code like a year and a half ago. And many wanted to pause to see what the impacts might be when it came to use of potentially unknown or unknown use of copyrighted material. There seems to have been a broader awareness and acceptance, I think, over the last 6 to 9 months. So it seems like AI-generated code and use of AI coding assistance by commercial organizations seems to be normalizing. So that said, there's still additional considerations beyond just accepting its use. Managing open source license compliance with AI-generated code is still new-ish ground, and it's presenting challenges not fully considered by some organizations. For example, most AI solutions for developers don't currently disclose information about the origins and licenses of source code that they produce as an output. There are a few, or at least a couple, that have some information. Even if these AI coding assistants were trained using only permissively licensed open source, there's still obligations that need to be met, even if that means you only need to reproduce a copyright notice and license file. But how would the average user be able to comply with the licensing obligations for source code from an AI's output if they don't know who the copyright holders are or what the license terms are? So interestingly, we've had an increase in the number of requests for us to assist with detecting use of AI-generated code in order to help put together a more comprehensive license compliance material So from our perspective, we treat AI generated code similar to how we would treat something that came from Stack Overflow or any other copy paste of code. So this generally means we're running a scan and looking for code snippets or other evidence of open source that might require attribution or other licensing obligations. Jon, over to you. What are some of your thoughts on what will happen with the use of AI coding assistants?
Thank you, Russ. I think you're absolutely right. The usage of these tools is certainly normalizing. And I selected a few quotes that I think help us understand how quickly things are evolving and also what to expect from the future. The first one being from Mark Zuckerberg himself, an interview that was released last week, where he said that AI agents will match good mid-level engineers this year. And that doesn't mean that AI agents are going to replace engineers. It's just that they are going to take care of a lot of the tasks that we engineers do. I think, as an example, I had a conversation with a friend of mine that works at a car manufacturer last week, where he made it pretty clear that they haven't been developing unit tests for quite a while. And it's the same story here in FossID. We rely on an AI coding assistants to do that task. And I think very likely, code reviews is probably next in line, where AI coding assistants are going to do a very good job and it's going to make us much more efficient. So I think we'll see many tasks being replaced, not necessarily engineers being replaced. The next quote is from GitHub survey from 2024 that says 97% of developers admit to using generative AI. And that doesn't mean that they're using generative AI on a daily basis, but certainly that they have used it, right? And 97% is a large percentage. Pretty much almost everybody have used it by now. And I think we'll see that all of them adopt it going forward very quickly. Third one is 40% of platform engineering teams will be using AI to augment every phase of the software development lifecycle. And that will be by 2027, according to Gartner. And so think about it for a minute. I'm talking software development lifecycle. There's a lot of things that go into those phases, from planning to analysis, design, development, the testing, implementation, maintenance. AI will be touching all of those phases. And I couldn't agree more. Probably will happen even earlier. Another really interesting quote from that article from Gartner is, increased reliance on AI-generated code may lead to 25% of production defects or due to insufficient human oversight. So that's also interesting. Maybe some of us won't be losing our jobs after all. So yeah, there's still going to be human oversight that is required, and we're going to coexist with AI coding assistants, for the foreseeable future. Let's move on to the next slide. First, lay down the kind of options that as a developer you have today, from GitHub Copilot, ChatGPT, Gemini from Google, Code Whisperer from Amazon, Claude from Anthropic, and Cursor AI from Anisphere. And these are some of the ones that I have tried, and some of I would agree, I would say the most famous ones, but there are many more that I haven't tried that you will see. GitLab Duo, Tab9, Codium AI, and in December 2024, Google released a new model called Jules. So there's a lot of models out there. I have been using Copilot since the closed beta in 2021, and I've been blown away by the progress and how much efficient it makes me as a developer. And in recent weeks, I've actually moved over to Cursor. And I think Cursor from Anisphere is absolutely incredible. I think it improves the suggestions a little bit, and that is helped me become even more efficient than I was with Copilot. So really blown away by the progress. The current situation, the way I see it, is a little bit Apple versus Android, where on the one hand, we have dominant players with enterprise offerings, and on the other hand, we have a diverse ecosystem of startups. We have the dominant players being obviously Microsoft, Google, Amazon, where the diverse ecosystem of startups would be Anthropic, and then Anisphere with Cursor, and many more. Like I said, there's only so many I can try during the time that I spend in front of my computer. So there are many that I haven't been able to try. I look forward to do so. I think the problem with all of this is, like Russ mentioned, is license attribution. And these tools, for the most part, focus on efficiency, don't necessarily focus on license compliance. But there is, however, two of these tools that do offer some built-in functionality for license compliance. And first is Copilot, which has code referencing, and also has the ability to turn off suggestions that match publicly available code in GitHub, that is. If you use code referencing, then suggestions that come from Copilot, provided that they match repositories up to November 2021 from GitHub, then you have a link to those so that you can do the proper license attribution. And then if we move over to the other one that has some built-in functionality, that would be Code Whisperer. They call it code citations or reference tracking. I've seen both terms. I don't know which one they're going to go for, or if they will be using both. So code citations and reference tracking. And they also have functionality to filter license, certain suggestions depending on the license. So license filtering. So I guess if you don't want to use maybe GPL code, you can configure the tool to not suggest GPL code. But the little testing that I've done, I seem to have the coverage of this functionality is a bit unclear to me. It seems that I'm getting matches to AWS training repos, but not necessarily things outside that. So I haven't tested enough. So it's unclear the coverage of this functionality. Long story short, I think license attribution is to a great degree still a big challenge with AI coding assistant tools. So as Aaron mentioned in the beginning, we at FossID, we do open source audits for M&A transactions, and we've been doing so since 2016. So we've been gathering data ever since, and it's really fun for me to go back and look at that data and look at the statistics and see what they show. In this slide, we can see the usage of or the snippets that we find in the open source audits that we conduct, and from 2022 to 2023, we see a small increase. And I think that increase is also present in previous years. Ever since we started, we see a small increase in snippets. And I think that's probably related to a certain degree to the fact that we keep increasing the coverage of our knowledge base. We keep improving the matching algorithms in our tool. And that probably would have something to do with our ability to find more snippets, certainly. But then we have an incredible jump from 2023 to 2024. I cannot attribute that jump in usage of snippets to increases in our knowledge base or improvements in our matching algorithms. I don't know for certain, but I think that this is probably related to the usage of AI coding assistants. So developers are using these more, and as a result, there is more code fragments that we find in these audits. So license compliance due to this is certainly getting trickier. Now, you always had to care about snippets, I think, but now there is so many more snippets. So that makes it a bit more complicated to do license compliance. You don't have to care only about components. You need to care about small fragments of open source as well. And compliance getting tricky leads me to the next prediction number 2. We think that license complexity is getting crazier. And there is 5 reasons why I think that is happening. The first one, we just looked at it. There's more and more code fragments or snippets being used, and that is going to affect the granularity of level of license compliance that we have to deal with. And look at license propagation and license compatibilities on a component level. It's already complicated enough. When you have to do it on a fragment or snippet level, is even more complicated. But reason number 2, which I think is really important, it is source available, and the increase that we see of companies using source available. And for those of you that are not familiar with it, source available is a model that follows the open source collaborative approach, but has restrictions. So as you know, open source, the definition of open source is that you can use the software for any purpose. But in this case, source available will not allow you to use the software for any purpose because it will have some restrictions, sometimes commercial restrictions. So source available looks like open source, but it's not. And there are many examples of this in recent years. We have MongoDB that went from AGPL version 3 to server-side public license in 2018. We have Elasticsearch that went from Apache to server-side public license and Elastic license version 2 in 2021. Actually, only to come back to AGPL in 2024. So that's an interesting case. It made a comeback to open source. I'm glad to see that. And we have the example of HashiCorp, with some of the software went from Mozilla Public License 2.0 to business source license. And that happened in 2023. And then we also have examples where open source projects like SemGrep and Redis, they go source available. And as a result, the community decides to create a fork and continue a parallel track with an open source project. And for SemGrep, it was OpenGrep, and for Redis, it was Valky. So there was 2 projects created in 2024 that are forks with the effort of remaining or keeping this software development open source. They're an open source license. So source available makes license compliance complex. And why is that? Because first of all, it's kind of complicated to comply. When you're looking at source available, you have things like the Microsoft Shared Source License initiative, where you might have restrictions on what operating system you run the software on. You can only run it on Windows. I know that some licenses have that restriction, so it's quite hard to keep track of the software that you might be using internally, and then make sure that it's only run under on a specific operating system. And obviously, when you go into source available that has commercial restrictions, then it makes it even more complicated because you need to make sure that you're complying with those obligations. Also, it can be complicated to understand. If you look at Commons Clause, that is an addition that you can put on any open source license. It's been used mostly on Apache version 2, but we saw the example of Neo4j, a Swedish company that used Commons Clause on a GPL license. And you make an addition to an existing license, which it can make it a bit complicated to understand. And then the other reason why I think source available makes license compliance complicated is because of what I mentioned before about forks being created. When we do in audits, I know that I have seen sometimes looking at matches of code that could potentially come from the original project that went source available, or the fork that remained or it did a parallel track and continued with an open source license. And it's really hard sometimes to understand the origin of that code when it's been forked and it has 2 parallel tracks with similar development, at least for some time. So I think we would all agree source available, it makes license compliance more complicated. And here in this slide, we have to the left-hand side an analysis that we did recently, where we went through a few hundred licenses, the licenses that we find the most during our open source audits, and we categorize them by different licensing models. So we have, as a not surprise to anybody, permissive being the most common type of licenses that we find. Then copyleft, both strong and weak, is also quite common. But it was very surprising to me that they were source available and source available with a specific non-commercial obligation to account for 22% of the licenses that we see. That was a percentage that was much higher than I was expecting to see. So interesting numbers. And to the right-hand side, we have statistics from our open source audits where we've seen an increase almost doubled from 2023 to 2024. So companies are using more source available. I think the only reason that I can think of is that there's a lot of projects that are actually making that transition, as I mentioned. So that results in companies using more source available. And in the next slide, as part of this prediction, license compliance gets crazier. I mentioned 2 reasons, and I have 3 more. The first one, we can see an increase on companies using copyleft over the years, especially from 2023 to 2024. And I think that's probably related to the fact that the maturity around using open source increases, which means companies get more comfortable using open source. And I've seen the transition. Some companies in the beginning didn't want to use copyleft, but they understand that it's much easier to comply than it is to avoid. So they start using more and more copyleft as a result. I think that might be related to it. Then reason number 4 is we see an increase on multi-licensed software. So dual license, three-word license, we see that trend also happening. There's more software with that type of licensing model where you have 2 licenses to choose from or 3 licenses to choose from. And we see that usage increasing as well. And in general, we just see at least a double of usage of open source in our open source audits from 2023 to 2024. And thinking of that, I think that's probably also connected to the fact that package managers keep bringing more and more packages to do a simple Hello World application. So I think package managers probably are part of the reason why we see this increase as well. So quick recap, we have increase in snippets, source available, copyleft, multi-license, and open source in general, which makes license compliance space more complicated. What do you say about this, Russ?
Great points, Jon, and you covered a lot of information here. So I'll just add a few brief points that I've observed in our practice. So I think, as you mentioned, with the exponential growth in available software to use from package managers and AI-generated code, so we're seeing combinations of many different pieces of open source that are being distributed together by various means. So like as Jon was saying, when you combine these different pieces of open source, most often this creates a multi-license scenario, since each of the pieces of open source likely started with their own license for that particular component or piece. Combine them, and now you have several different combinations of licenses with different obligations that all need to be complied with. So from a practical level, what often happens is that developers are implementing these combined packages and perhaps only paying attention to what top-level license is being stated for a given package or a given project. But then, we get in there, or the company's own OSPO gets in there with scanning tools, and then additional subcomponents and obligations are uncovered or identified, and all hopefully before the software is released. And let's talk about OSPOs. Let's start with some basics before we get too far, for those that might not be familiar. So at their core, an open source program office, or OSPOs, support and enable 2 primary functions: consumption of and contribution to open source. So an OSPO typically serves as the center of expertise within your company, and it can be ideal if you need a scalable method to manage and track your company's use of open source, and then often provides developers and leaders with knowledge, documentation, expertise to ensure the successful consumption and contribution of open source. So almost all companies that distribute or provide software need an OSPO, or at least someone to fill those functions. So sometimes this can be a team of one. It can be a part-time resource if your particular case doesn't warrant a fully staffed OSPO. But here's why we expect continued growth in OSPOs, but especially in small to mid-market companies. According to the 2024 State of OSPOs and Open Source Management from the Linux Foundation, the number one benefit anticipated from implementing an OSPO by organizations that don't already have one is more awareness and of use, of open source use, and more awareness of dependencies. So I think this is something that most organizations would aspire to have, is more awareness on their use of open source. So it's difficult to overstate how valuable this can be, because it can help with managing license compliance, helps with reporting accurate SBOMs, helps with managing vulnerabilities, just to name a few, which is likely why 77% of large organizations already have an OSPO. So compare that to a report from GitHub in 2023, where they found that 30% of Fortune 100 companies, so presumably also large organizations, had OSPOs at that time. So obviously there's been some growth in this space over the last year and a bit, and we expect this trend to continue. We also expect that this will drive growth in small and medium-sized organizations, where only 19% of small organizations have an OSPO and 33% of medium organizations have an OSPO. So we've been seeing more growth in small and medium-sized organizations. Many are staffing their own small OSPOs, or they're engaging with us to provide our managed OSPO as a service. In addition to our own observations, the Linux Foundation published an estimate that they expect 105% growth in OSPOs for small organizations over the next 2 years. Another factor contributing to the growth and establishment of OSPOs will be standards, global regulations, and guidance from governments. So one interesting and practical example, the US federal government has been pushing for each agency to establish management and controls over use of open source, including the implementation of OSPOs. So one agency in particular I came across is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, so CMS, which has a public-facing OSPO page on their site, which is pretty cool if you think about how unlikely something like this might have been just 8 or 10 years ago. John, anything to add?
Yeah, just 77% of large organizations having an OSPO, that is incredible. That's a percentage that is much higher than I would have thought. So if you guys are working for a large organization and you don't have an OSPO, what are you doing with your life? So this is really important. You certainly need to get your head around this. I wanted to add to that OSPO, I think my experience prior to FossID working at an OSPO is that it will help you find potential intellectual property issues related with open source. So license propagation or sometimes even patent grants that might be related to the usage of open source. So very important. And this leads me to the next prediction. IP issues leads me to the next prediction, which is license compliance is taken more seriously. And I think nothing gets taken more seriously than when it's taken to court. And because of that, I have a couple of court cases from 2024 that I'm going to talk about. And I think they're very interesting, and it helps us understand what is happening and what's likely to happen during 2025 and beyond. The first one is Sebastian's Tech versus AVM. And this is a bit of a David versus Goliath kind of case, where we have on the one hand side a single developer from Germany, which of course had the help of the Software Freedom Conservancy, that takes on one of Europe's leading manufacturers of home network equipment. So we have a single developer against a very large company in Europe. Again, I said a single developer, that's where the case started, but I want to emphasize that the Software Freedom Conservancy was representing Sebastian. And the story goes that Sebastian in 2021 bought a router from AVM called Fritzbox 4020, and he wanted to add some login functionality to the firmware, so had access to the code, particularly an LGPL library, and he did not have access to scripts for compiling and installing the software. So the license obligations for the LGPL will not fulfill, and that led Sebastian to sue AVM in a Berlin court in 2023. And in 2024, the court ruled in favor of Sebastian, so that AVM had to release all of those scripts and also pay legal fees. So we see that license compliance or license obligations are enforced. And I think for those of us that love open source, you got to play by the rules, and is good news to see that this is being enforced in courts. The next one is now we go from Germany to France. And here we have the case of Introvert versus Orange. And Introvert is a French software company, and Orange, I'm sure you all know about, is a major telecom company in Europe. And this case, what happened was Introvert developed a tool designed to handle single sign-on implementations called Lasso, and released under the version 2 of the GPL. And this was a tool that Orange took, modified, and distributed without complying with the license obligations. And that resulted on Introvert suing Orange for a GPL violation. And what happened here is that the Paris Court of Appeal ruled in favor of Introvert, and Orange had to pay over 900,000 euros in both financial losses and moral damages. And I think that's kind of interesting. I've never seen moral damages being considered in this type of cases. So very interesting to see. Russ, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just more from a practical perspective. So, I mean, what are perhaps some practical steps we can take to ensure compliance with open source licenses? So one is make sure you understand what open source you're using, especially in distributed products, and that you've documented each license that applies. So this most often requires the use of software composition analysis tooling that scans the source code. Once you have that, make sure you're following all of the license requirements. And our aim should really be full compliance with all open source license obligations. But we should make sure that we at least comply with those obligations that aren't really up for debate, like providing notice and attribution, copies of license terms, etc. This is like low-hanging fruit, and it's been the trigger for many of the topics and cases that Jon was just speaking about. So just maybe some quick key takeaways here. Open source licenses, the obligations are not optional. The open source licenses are legally enforceable. And as Jon mentioned, violating them can lead to big fines. And finally, in order to reduce some of the risks, it's important to develop policies and processes to manage your use of open source software. And let's say SBOM automation becomes more realistic. So the CEO of FossID, Stuart Dross, he recently stated that several of the largest private companies and industries have adopted SBOM and are driving SBOM requirements down through their supplier ecosystems. And that for industries like automotive, healthcare, and financial services, these requirements have been codified in terms and conditions of their contracts. As a result, 2025 will see the broad adoption of SBOMs through private industry, not specifically or exclusively government regulation. So we also see other global regulations and industry standards that are calling for software tracking and transparency, though not necessarily referring to SBOM by name. So after adoption of SBOM and its variants comes the need to scale, which of course brings up the topic of automation of SBOMs. So let's start with some of the more common pain points of SBOMs. For the most part, putting together a comprehensive SBOM can't be done with the output of a single tool. And this is because an SBOM can be made up of not just open source, but also proprietary and other third-party software. So often this requires a multi-tool approach to gather all of this information. Another pain point is that application or package level scanning may be acceptable today until a source SBOM is required by one of your customers. So even with the assistance of scanning tools, there is most often still a bit of manual work required to putting together an SBOM. If you happen to be part of a supply chain, you might have to think about not just generating an SBOM, but also the ability to consume someone else's SBOM, which can present new kinds of problems that you may not have thought about. For example, license declarations that we spoke about on the last prediction, those might be required to be provided on an SBOM. I don't believe there are any regulations around this from an SBOM perspective, but there are several industries where organizations are requiring licenses to be declared on an SBOM. If you only have, if you've only considered a narrow set of requirements for your process or for your SBOM machinery, then the addition of these licensing fields has the potential to break that machinery or that process because they haven't been accounted for with the extra fields. Another pain point might be aggregating supplier SBOMs into a master SBOM. I haven't yet seen a tool that can take multiple SBOMs and turn them into a product or device SBOM. So to be sustainable longer term, SBOM automation needs to become a reality, and we think 2025 will be the year we see big gains in SBOM automation technology. Aaron, just looking at the time, maybe we can go back over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, thank you. We do have a few questions that came in. So just a reminder, everybody, if something caught your attention, need some clarification, we're surprised something wasn't in the top 5, yeah, share it and we'll chat about it with the time remaining. But we do have a couple questions in already. The first one is regarding OSPOs. It says, are OSPOs only required when you contribute to the OSS community? Or what about if you only consume OSS?
As I mentioned in an earlier prediction there on an earlier slide, most OSPOs are focused on either consumption of or contributions to open source. I mean, they can certainly do both, but when it comes to managing risk, we find that most companies often place a greater focus on managing consumption, again, due to the risk, and that managing contributions typically comes after consumption is being well managed. So it's not like one is more important than the other. Certainly, there are plenty of OSPOs that fulfill both of these functions. But from a priority perspective, just based on the risk, we find that again, most companies are placing a greater focus on managing the consumption.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Another question regarding maybe some of the audit data that we've seen. Question is direct dependency versus transitive dependency. Any observations there? For example, have we seen transitive dependencies for each direct dependency increasing on average?
Well, that's a good point, and I must admit that we have not gathered data to answer that, but it is a good question. And when we do audits, we treat direct and transitive dependencies equally, so we don't make a distinction. However, again, this is a good question, so probably we should try to keep track of it so that we can have a better understanding of what happens and what trends there might be. I think because of the fact that what I mentioned before, that open source is increasing in general, I think, and I had to attribute at least partially to the fact that package managers bring more and more dependencies. I would imagine that transitive dependencies and the number of them are increasing. I wouldn't be surprised if we see this trend in the data, but unfortunately we don't have the data to confirm. But I would bet money on that for sure. What do you think, Russ?
I agree. So we've seen the same thing. We haven't collected the data, specifically in our scanning and audit division, but certainly with this explosion in the growth of software, most likely, I mean, it's usually in dependencies, and I have to imagine it's largely transitive dependencies that are causing that.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Well, I'll write that down. Maybe that's something I can check in with the audit team and see if they can dig and find any insights on that. So I just jotted that down as a note for the audience that I'll look into that. Another question goes back to your earlier charts, Jon. When you show the multi-licenses in the bar chart showing the increase of snippets, are you referencing, is a multi-license a reference to a copyleft and a permissive license, or could this be any combination of license, whether it's permissive, open source, source available? So it's really that definition of when we say multi-license, is it any multiple licenses or particularly copyleft and something?
Yeah, good point. I can totally see how that might have been a bit confusing. It refers to open source libraries or components or artifacts that have different choices of licensing. You have, I think Elasticsearch will be a good example where you can use under server-side public license or Elastic license version 2, and you can choose which one of the two you want to fulfill. So it could be two source available licenses. It could be a permissive and a copyleft. We see a lot of that. Or it could be, in some cases, it is an open source or permissive and a full proprietary. So whatever software that gives you more than one option in terms of what license you want to use it under and what obligations you need to fulfill, that is what we would consider multi-license. And we see an increase in that type of open source, and even down to the snippet level. And I think that perhaps it is connected to the fact that we become more and more mature in terms of using open source, and sometimes we perhaps see that, or many projects see that one license alone doesn't really fulfill all the use cases, and they want to have more than one to make sure that they make more use cases available and they give more choice. So I think that might be related to it. Do you have any thoughts on this, Russ?
Yeah, in addition to that, I think it's, again, like I mentioned on an earlier slide, we were talking about the combination of open source, just where people have pulled pieces from this package, pieces from that package, this component, that component, put it all together into one package that can be pulled in, like maybe as a dependency, but each of those had their own licenses potentially. So it could have been like one could have been Apache 2, the other could have been BSD3, another one could have been LGPL, whatever, but now you have to comply with all of them that got kind of commingled, if you will.
Hey guys, I got one more question, and people love the data apparently. So here's another data question for you. So if you can pull this off the top of your head, that'll be amazing, but it might be a follow-up. So going back to source available, which source available license is the most commonly seen in at least from your guys' perspective? SSPL or anything else?
Depends on the technology. I think it depends on the technology. Personally, I think it depends on the technology, but that's being used, and that's what determines the license. But yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I had to agree with you, Russ. It will depend on the technology, but if I had to put money, I think business source license, BSL, is gaining momentum. So I see that one. I think if you asked me a year ago, maybe I would have said server side public license, but now business source license seems to be the one source available license that is gaining most momentum. It certainly wouldn't be the commons clause, for example. That's very rarely used. So yeah, my money is on the BSL, but we don't have the data. But I will make sure to for next year's prediction, or maybe something that we can post on LinkedIn, Aaron. If I get the data, we can make a post and share these really interesting questions. Thank you for those.
Yeah, absolutely. Great questions, everyone. And we're right about at time. I don't see any additional questions. So that's a wrap. But if you do think of something later, please do reach out. You know where to find us. You can contact OSS Consultants or FossID. Of course, you can find these two guys on LinkedIn very easily and message them directly. But I did take some notes. I'm going to do some digging and see if we can come up with some more insights as well to publish behind those charts. And of course, an email with the replay will be available in the next 24 hours. You'll be receiving that. And thanks, Russ. Thanks, John. And thank you, everyone out there, for joining us. And have a great day. Talk to you later.